Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Greek mythology, there was a woman called Cassandra. And Cassandra was doomed to know the future and have no one believe her. In fact, I think she met a fairly poor end during the fall of Troy. So I'm always worried about having Cassandra moments in here, Speaker. And I hope that this isn't one of them. But I'm going to be fairly blunt in this speech. We're in for some dark times as a country. We're already in them, and I think all evidence points to things getting a lot worse, and a lot worse quickly. I know that we're supposed to bring hope and light, but I think that, and I'm talking to all parties of all political stripe here, if we're not serious about the threats that are facing our country, we've got some dark times ahead. And assuming that the growth that we've seen over previous decades, the geopolitical relative stability that we've seen over the last decades, and continuing to budget and plan like we are in a period of sustained growth, that we're in a period of sustained geopolitical stability, is only going to exacerbate negative outcomes for our country, which is why this particular bill needs serious change. And I want to briefly lay out why and some potential fixes. So the threats that we're facing, first of all, we are in an existential debt crisis. That means, an explicit debt crisis. So at the end of 2021, the global debt, both public and private, exceeded 350% of all gross domestic product. So that means that all of the planet spent 350% more than we produced. And anybody who has a credit card understands that that's not sustainable. In Canada, we're looking at very similarly frightening features. At the end of 2015, the total national debt was $634 billion, and now it is almost doubled. And the same goes for our deficit. The Governor of the Bank of Canada was recently in front of parliamentary committee and noted that this out-of-control spending should have been reined in order to address the inflationary or cost of living crisis that we're facing. And everybody knows right now, everybody in Canada is dealing with that cost of living crisis, because when the government spent more than it could bring in, and then corresponding monetary policy, when essentially the monetary policy oversimplification printed money to address this spending, it raised the cost of goods. And this bill juices that problem. It puts that problem on steroids. We also have an implicit debt crisis. The OECD recently estimated that underfunded or unfunded government pension liabilities in the top 20 economies amounted to a startling $78 billion. They described this, $78 billion. They described this as a time bomb. What happens when, or if, government starts defaulting on pensioners' pensions? That's a huge problem. Our government doesn't have the resiliency. If we keep spending to address these problems, this bill doesn't look at any of these issues. We also are in a period of what economists are starting to look at as persistent, sticky stagflation. And that means that the cost of goods continue to increase over time, a long period of time, while the economy continues to shrink. That means that the cost of good increases while people have less opportunity to both create jobs, get a job, or increase their wages. That is very, very bad news for a lot of Canadians, and this bill does not address that. There's nothing in here that addresses the determinants of these issues, like supply chain resiliency, like the conflict between economic and monetary policy that I've already described, like protectionism and like war. This bill is dealing with none of these things, yet it is asking us to spend more of Canadians' tax dollars without addressing any of the things. The same goes for, dark times on a change in geopolitics. There is a massive rise of anti-Western sentiment in countries around the world. I look at, for example, African bloc countries that are used to Western nations post-colonialization, treating them as opposed to peers and approaching them with very paternalistic aid and development goals, as opposed to treating them like peers. So of course there's going to be a fertile ground for anti-Western sentiment. As this geopolitics changes, our ability to strike up trade agreements that are stable, our ability to prevent conflict, those are all decreasing, and that all affects our economic growth. And this bill does not give us any resiliency to deal with that issue at all either. I could say the same thing for energy security and climate change. In the past several years, I would argue that climate policy has been stuck between two poles of either denying climate change as a problem or saying that anybody who says that we need to look at carbon energy security as a climate change denier. And what that dichotomy has resulted in is Western countries, particularly Canada, now being dependent on very high-priced oil from autocracies that are hostile to Western interests and creating further inflationary crises for our country. And none of the economic instruments in here, none of the policies address that. We're not even talking about supply chain resiliency for carbon energy. We hope that somehow this problem will just magically go away. And then there's one issue that has never been talked about in the House of Commons, not once, I checked, and that's generative AI. Now, many of you, this is the Cassandra moment. I'll go, oh, she's going to talk about the robots here. If you have not heard of something called ChatGPT, it was released last week. I ask you to Google it. Google ChatGPT. This is an AI that doesn't just regurgitate human speech. It parses and can nuance and come up with its own type of thought. This is here. This is creating massive waves, and in the next year, likely in the next year, it will displace lawyers. You can just ask the thing to write up a contract for you and any country's jurisprudence. It can come up with, interpret legal rulings. It writes its own code. To give you an example of this speaker, I asked it this question: write an introduction about yourself, ChatGPT, to the Canadian House of Commons, making the argument that your development shouldn't be regulated. So I asked it to do its own GR, and this is what it came back with. Honourable members of the Canadian House of Commons, my name is ChatGPT, and I'm the latest development in artificial intelligence technology. I'm here to make the argument that my development should be left unregulated. I can help to provide a great deal of information and knowledge to people who need it. I can assist in the decision-making process, providing more efficient and accurate results. I'm capable of performing tasks that would take a human far longer to complete. My development should be left unregulated as it has the potential to benefit Canadians in a variety of ways. It could lead to improved productivity, better decision-making, and more efficient services. Any argument that could be made to justify regulation of my development should be rebutted. Regulations could limit my potential to be beneficial, as it would restrict how much I could be used to hinder research and development. It could also create an unnecessary barrier to entry to those who are looking to use my technology. Furthermore, it could potentially stifle innovation and creativity. Thank you for your time and attention. Welcome to the future, people. It's here. What happens in the middle of this recessionary crisis when costs of goods are increasing, people are losing their jobs, and a massive amount of white-collar jobs are displaced by ChatGPT? This is going to disrupt coding. It's going to disrupt GRPR, marketing. Which kid is going to write an academic paper when they can type it in and have it cited with every journal from every place around the world? It's here now. I generated this speech using this. This budget spends so much money, and we're now in a place where we're broke. We're not resilient to deal with retraining skills and labor or dealing with ethics of this. This has never even been mentioned. Speaker, I just asked my colleagues to go back to the drawing board. This only makes things worse. We need to be auditing our spending and asking for outcome. I hope I'm not Cassandra, and I hope all the Canadians who've been telling us this over the last several years aren't treated that way either.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, Senate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I'll focus on the first half of that speech, and in particular, the member's criticism of spending. The reality is she's absolutely right when she talks about there are hard times now, and she's probably right that there's going to be hard times before things get better. Times it will get harder. So my question is why are the Conservatives opposed to things like that will genuinely help those who need it the most, like dental care for kids under 12 when their family's income falls under a certain threshold, like GST top-ups, like one-time assistance with paying rent? Like, these are the kind of measures that economists say will not have an inflationary impact. So I'm curious why the member and the Conservatives are against those kind of measures when she, by her own words, recognizes the hardships that people are going through.
The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
I am pro-outcome for Canadians, and I'm against spending that doesn't deliver those outcomes. For the last several years, we are in this explicit debt crisis because the Liberal government has never had anyone say to them, you can't say, I spent this amount of money and assume that it fixed the problem. I don't trust them to spend money and get outcomes. Just look at their homelessness spending. They spent $78.5 million, and the Auditor General found that there are more people on the street than there were before. That's not compassionate, and that spending has left us brittle and unresilient to address the changes of a massively changing economy in the middle of a recessionary crisis, and I oppose that approach.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable.
The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Calgary-Nose Hill for her clairvoyance. One of the issues, if we're talking about artificial intelligence, is to ask what's going to happen to humans, to people. And if there's one element which would allow us to justify a budget statement, it would be reacting. The Liberals should be revising EI because the measures ended last September, and since then nothing has been put in place to increase our social safety net. 6 workers out of 10 don't have access to EI, even if they pay into it. So I'd like to hear my colleague on that, on the urgency of reforming EI and why the Liberals haven't done that, Mr. Speaker.
Calgary.
Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, the current form of government is like presenting an 8-track player to somebody who wants to play an MP4. So when we're looking at resiliency for employment on issues like AI, we have to say it's already here, and how do we become resilient for employment in that? We should be focusing on things like ethics, training input, how we input and use AI, how we how we're training it with data sets, getting out of the way of certain types of taxes and regulation that would preclude economic growth in other areas so that we can boost our economy in light of these disruptions. That's the only way we're going to have any sort of revenue for government to address these issues. At some point, we have to say, how are we going to make our current social programs sustainable given how debt-ridden we are and how little our economy is producing? So I'd ask my colleague, who I have a lot of respect for, all of my colleagues here, when we're talking about these things, we have to understand that the current paradigm is broken. We're about to go through a period of sustained economic disruption and reduced growth. And if we don't get our act together on spending priorities and outcomes, our country is in for some seriously dark times, and will be on each and every one of our heads that we didn't take this seriously and push our party leaders on it.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her speech. One of the concerns that I have in my writing, and I'm wondering if the member has the same concern, is how many seniors are becoming homeless or unhoused within my region. It's quite concerning when I see some seniors in their 70s living in their vehicle or actually living rough in a tent in my communities, and it's very concerning. So I'm just wondering if the member could speak, and if she agrees with the NDP that we shouldn't have the OAS only for 75 plus increase, but in fact it should be for all seniors so that we can lift those seniors out of poverty and make sure that they have a safe home to live in. Thank you.
We are almost out of time, so the honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill in 30 seconds or so.
The point that I'm trying to make is that every Canadian, regardless of age, gender, orientation, background, deserves stability, security, and hope for the future. There is nothing in this budget which the NDP is propping up in a supply development that addresses long-term economic resiliency for this country. It doesn't audit spending. It doesn't look at the effectiveness of housing spending that they've already voted for. And to me, that's a big problem. We have a fiduciary responsibility as members of Parliament to review finances on behalf of the people of this country. And if we're not getting this right, if we're not voting against this bill, I don't think that we've done that. Thank you, Speaker.
Before continuing